All right, so here's a mini lecture on chapter 9, which is intelligence. Not much to say in this mini lecture because it is mini, so it's going to be short, but do encourage you, as always, to read your textbook carefully, complete the mastery training exercise throughout the week, and focus on the discussion board question for this week, which is about which theory of intelligence you find to be most effective and why. So, what is intelligence? Briefly, we'll talk about the scientific definition of what we mean by intelligence. We will talk about several theories. I will introduce a few of the main theories. There is a lot of controversy here, so keep that in mind. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about measurement issues. When we're talking about intelligence, how should we assess what we're meaning by that? So first, what is intelligence? What we mean by this as a research community is how well one can perform cognitive activities. And we can mean this in a variety of ways. And so that leads to a number of different leading theories, such as, do we mean one general level of intelligence, or can we describe different, what we call specific intelligences? In other words, can I be intelligent in one way but not so much in another? It depends, it turns out, on which theory you're looking at. Some things to keep in mind are that we do have correlations between abilities on certain tasks. For instance, I can be really adept in verbal reasoning, and I also can be high in analytical or mathematical reasoning, but there might not be a perfect correlation. So how do I account for that? That's one consideration. And I do encourage you to read more about this in your textbook, the difference between fluid and crystallized intelligence. Briefly, fluid is that idea about problem solving in the moment. So, for instance, right now we're in the middle of a global pandemic of COVID-19. Problem solving would be a way that we could assess people's fluid intelligence. How well are they able to think outside the box? And related to something we talked about in the previous chapter, fluid intelligence is something that would be connected to the term functional fixedness. So if we're thinking outside the box, remember that we have something new or novel, and people are referring to this coronavirus as novel, the COVID-19 strain. So that would all be under the level of fluid intelligence. Whereas crystallized intelligence is more about facts. So things like when exactly did something occur in history, or what's a terminology mean. So next I'll move into several of the leading theories of intelligence. One is Spearman's G factor, and G stands for general. So according to Spearman, who was one of the first influencers of theories of intelligence, he believed that we all have a single number, it turns out, that could be captured in telling us our intelligence. Contrast that with a contemporary theory. Robert Sternberg is one of the other leading theorists, and he proposes something that he calls the triarchic theory of intelligence, tri referring to three, which he refers to three aspects. He says that we can be either intelligent analytically, creatively, or practically, and all of these are not mutually exclusive. In other words, I can be highly intelligent analytically, meaning, for instance, in school, but not so much in practical intelligence, for instance, common sense. So you might think about analytical being what we call book smarts and practical being quote unquote street smarts. And then creative intelligence, according to Sternberg's idea, would refer to things like music or the arts. So again, you might think, well, I might be high in one of these areas but low in the others. And according to Sternberg, that's important to keep in mind by comparison to Spearman's G factor, which would just say you either are or are not intelligent. And finally, we have one of the other leading theorists. Gardner proposes his theory, what he refers to as multiple intelligences. And depending on which textbook and what references you refer to, he either argues for 8 or 9 different specific categories of intelligence. For instance, he says verbal and mathematical should be distinct. Going back to Sternberg, he said analytical, that would capture both of those. Spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, musical, inter and intrapersonal, inter being between people. So we're encouraged right now to be keeping distance between each other, so that interpersonal space is very important. Intra, however, is within the person. And you might say, well, how could I be intelligent within myself? This is knowing yourself, knowing things about who you are and how that connects to other people. And things like what we'll finally talk about, emotional intelligence. So if you're able to regulate your emotions well or not. Gardner also refers to naturalist intelligence and existentialist, and a lot of people right now are in a crisis existentially, thinking about what the meaning of life is and things like the end of life. So again, I encourage you to look more closely at those different theories in the textbook and refer to those when you are completing your discussion board for this week. I did mention this terminology, EQ, emotional intelligence, whereas general theories of intelligence, all the preceding ones that we briefly discussed, we don't tend to see any sex differences, meaning men and women are approximately equivalent in those levels of intelligence. Research indicates that we do see a sex difference with emotional intelligence, such that women tend to be higher in emotional intelligence. One of the leading reasons that this is believed to occur is because women have more nurturing roles, or they have assumed those nurturing roles more predominantly than men, and therefore they need to know both what other people are expressing in terms of emotions and how to regulate their own. So we do, again, see that sex difference with emotional intelligence, such that women are tending to be higher in general. Again, we always have exceptions to those generalities, but we do tend to see a general difference that women are higher in emotional intelligence than men. Finally, what I want to point out here is, so whatever we're calling intelligence, how do we measure that? Albert Binet argued that we should use a quotient, or in other words, think of this very mathematically. He referred to what he calls the mental age, and he said that we should divide that by someone's chronological age and then multiply that by 100. And this is how we refer to someone's quote-unquote intelligence or IQ. So what do we mean by these terms, mental and chronological age? Mental age, according to Binet, is we would give you a series of tests and we would look at, on average, how you are performing those tests compared to people of certain ages. So for instance, let's say that you are 5 and I give you a series of tests that an 8-year-old could easily perform, and you perform those well, then I would say that you have a mental age of 8 compared to your chronological age, which is how old you are. So in that example I just gave, this would be an example of 8 divided by 5 times 100, and that is how we get that average IQ. And again, on average, humans have the IQ of 100, meaning that we are 1 over 1. In other words, if I'm 10 years old, I am on average performing as a typical 10-year-old. And then we do have a standard deviation of about 15. So this is where, if you were to look at the population level IQ based on this way of measuring it, the general population would fall between the ranges of 100 to 115, that's one standard deviation, as well as 85 to 100, so that's one standard deviation below. In other words, if your IQ, if you ever took an IQ test, or if you were to take an IQ test, was about that, then you are typically average compared to the adult population. However, we do have a lot of evidence for something that researchers refer to as the Flynn effect, which is, on average, every generation is performing significantly better on IQ tests than the previous generation. This is a small difference, but it is significant. So for instance, your generation is approximately 2 to 3 IQ points higher on average than your parents. and their IQ scores on average are approximately 2 to 3 points, give or take, higher than their parents. So some of the questions that researchers are asking is, why is this? And we don't know the full story of why the Flynn effect is occurring, but one leading theory for why the Flynn effect is happening is because we have advances in medicine and technology, and those are allowing us to keep people alive longer and therefore higher intelligence. Other considerations that I just want to mention briefly are that depending on how we write assessment items, they can be more or less or easily interpreted depending on one's culture. So for instance, this is a link to Raven's progressive matrices, and this is simply pattern recognition. However, if we were to see another test of intelligence, this might be biased in terms of the patterns that are more or less prevalent in certain cultures. So that's just one thing we need to keep in mind. And finally, I just want to mention that in twin studies, we do tend to see that we have the nature and nurture interacting. In other words, we have twins that are raised together and raised apart, and we do tend to see biological impacts of intelligence. In other words, they might have similar intelligence levels, as well as um, those who are raised in the same environment tend to have but are not biologically related, tend to also have similar IQ levels. So we do have this, again, this repeating pattern that we tend to see of the interaction between nature and nurture. So this has been a mini lecture. If we were in class, I would say a lot more about this, but again, go back to your book, make sure that you read it carefully, finish your mastery training, and I look forward to reading about your thoughts on the different theories of intelligence. Take care.